And welcome to the UCFsports.com preview of this Saturday's Georgia Tech game. The Yellow Jackets are making the trip down to Orlando in the bounce house with a 4 p.m. kick on ESPNU. And I'm privileged and honored to be joined by Kelly Quinlan, the publisher of Jackets Online on the Rivals Network. Welcome, Kelly.
Hey, thanks, Brandon, for having me.
Yeah. This is the return game. UCF, this was in 2020. That was the weird COVID year. This was a UCF season opener that year. And it was kind of lucky for UCF. The game got played because all these conferences, some of them were doing conference only schedules. And, I think the ACC might've had, one non-conference game, and Georgia Tech obviously would have played Georgia if they could. And I think the SEC went conference only. So that kind of opened the door for, this game to remain. I think it was Georgia Tech's second game. I think they were coming off a win off of Florida State that year. But UCF won that game 49-21. And this is the return game from that. But honestly, this game, before we kind of talk about everything going on, this home game for UCF was supposed to be played in 2017. I think it was the third or so week of that 2017 season. Obviously, UCF fans know all about that year. That was the undefeated season, the perfect season, the national championship season. But this game was washed out due to Hurricane Irma. And I knew that was kind of a controversial thing at the time. Irma obviously was a devastating hurricane, went through the state of Florida. Orlando wasn't hit all that bad. There were minimal power outages, I remember, in the area. But at that point, Scott Frost was the head coach. You didn't really know how bad the storm was going to be when it hits. He sent all the players home. They weren't practicing, early in that week. The National Guard set up shop at the stadium. I guess they couldn't go anywhere else. And so the game was called off. What do you kind of remember about that, Kelly? Because I know that was controversial. A lot of people thought, should UCF have, gone up to Atlanta and played the game there? Could the game have still gone on in Orlando? What do you kind of remember about that time period?
So the whole thing there was they tried to I was talking to Paul Johnson that whole week, the people that worked at Georgia Tech. And then I had a couple guys that I knew from various connections that were at UCF as well. So I was talking to them. I was monitoring what was going on with USF down the street. They played their game that week. They played at Illinois and beat them with 1 day of practice. They practiced like that Friday or something. They had Charlie Strong had one practice, and then they went and played. To me, it was very strange that they didn't want to take the kids to Atlanta. It seemed sketchy. The more I dug into it, it seemed like, Scott Frost was trying to win at that point and move to his next job. And it wasn't a real secret. I know a couple of UCF boosters, one of whom played golf with him. And he was talking openly about how he was getting ready for his next move. He wanted to be a P5 coach. Nebraska wasn't open at the time, but I think he was thinking probably something bigger than that, actually. And he was trying to figure it out. And Georgia Tech ran the triple. They were coming off of a really good season in 16, where they beat Kentucky and they beat Georgia and Kentucky that year at the end of the season. So I could see it'd be why your thought process, and obviously they had no idea what was going to happen, if they were going to go on this run and finish the season undefeated. So there was all this discussion. Georgia Tech offered to let them come up here, let them practice. They could have arranged all of that. They offered to help with lodging and find them a place to stay. And the thing that got me was they were like, oh, we'll send the players home. And that to me seemed like the unsafest thing to do, because all of them are from Florida. So they're going to go to different areas. No one knows where a hurricane's going to go, right? So that was the thing I found a little galling in all of it, was just hey, if you really think about player safety, the safest thing you can do is take them somewhere where they're not in harm's way, right? And as a parent, if my kid was at college, I would want him to not stay somewhere where there's a storm. I wouldn't want him to come home if, it's tornado season here or whatever. I want him to go where it's safe. So I understood the reasoning a little bit, but it made no sense to just flip the game, play it in Atlanta for a year, flip the 2020 game and play it in Orlando and just call it a day, right? And instead they got canceled. There were a lot of hurt feelings over it. I think, to me, a little of it too was that Todd Stansbury, the AD, had worked at UCF, knew everyone there, and probably was more accommodating than other people would have been in the circumstance.
Exactly.
And so you ended up without this game. And I think, to me, would it have helped UCF, get in the playoffs or whatever? Probably not. It wouldn't have been a good enough win, but it would have been interesting to have that on their resume, another P5 skin, if you're going through that. But I understood where Scott Frost was coming from. Obviously, karma's a little bit of a what for him these days. He kind of blew you guys over and used you as a stepping stone to a better job in his mind, and now he's unemployed. So I guess it all worked out for everyone.
Yeah, I agree with generally with many of your points there. I just think UCF, knowing it was a triple option team, and no coach wants to prepare for that. It's so different. And they weren't, let's put it this way, UCF wasn't going to go out of their way to make sure the game got played. I definitely think that happened. Yeah.
Because the game last week was also a pushed back game. They played Ole Miss last week, got blown out. That Ole Miss game was supposed to be played like a decade ago. Ole Miss punted it twice. They should have just canceled the series like at that point. And instead they let them punt it twice and until Paul Johnson was gone, and then they were okay playing the game.
Now we can play.
Yeah, and especially probably watching what Geoff Collins has done. They were like, okay, yeah, we'll play this. Absolutely. We'll get easy P5 win and move along. And so those games, there's a series with Alabama coming up that got punted also from post after Saban got hired and after Coach Johnson started winning at Tech. I mean, it's very funny they had a lot of trouble scheduling too. That's why the UCF series happened. That's why their series with USF happened and a series with Temple. They were having trouble just finding anyone to play them with the option. Teams just didn't want to deal with it because it's a headache.
Right.
So now everyone's willing to schedule them.
Yeah. Hey, let's play.
Yeah. So let's jump on it.
There's a lot of interesting parallels between the two programs. A lot of UCF fans are familiar with some guys on the Georgia Tech sideline. Well, first of all, George O'Leary, the longtime Georgia Tech coach, went to Notre Dame for a cup of coffee. That didn't work out. Eventually resurfaced at UCF, is arguably, one of the legendary coaches in UCF history. There's a statue of him outside the stadium. He's coming back for this game. I know he was at the 2020 game in Atlanta, but he's going to be there. I believe he's going to be part of the coin toss. Obviously the ties there. Geoff Collins, Georgia Tech head coach, I believe might have been his first FBS assistant coaching job. May have been UCF full-time because he had been player personnel. He'd been, Western Carolina and FCS. He'd bounced around. He was at Georgia Tech, I think, during the tail end of the O'Leary era. But I think his first FBS coaching job was at UCF. And the thing that I always remember about Geoff Collins is that he was always ahead of the game on social media. I think he started in that 08, 09 time period. And no one knew what Twitter was. Twitter was brand new, was just kind of getting started. And he was posting stuff to Twitter. And I know a lot of UCF fans, I might have registered for Twitter at that time because, Geoff Collins was doing it. And people said, hey, have you heard of this thing called Twitter? We've got an assistant coach that's always tweeting, stuff on there. So he was kind of the Twitter coach back then. And obviously part of his staff, you've got Brent Key, Georgia Tech assistant head coach, offensive line coach. He was an O-line coach, was offensive coordinator at UCF for a year, was one time thought to be the head coach in waiting. A lot of people on that staff or within the program were hoping he was going to take over, or George O'Leary, I know, was hoping, he'd kind of be the heir apparent to him. And Andrew Thacker, who's defensive coordinator, he was an assistant coach during that era as well. And last but not least, Todd Stansbury, who you mentioned a minute ago, was the former UCF AD prior to Danny White. So is this kind of an interesting game from that standpoint? Just there's a lot of ex-UCF guys at Georgia Tech.
Yeah, it's been funny. I when I talked to Brent Key before they played in 2020, and he was not excited. He wasn't interested in. It brings up a lot of emotions, right? Even though he's a Georgia Tech guy at heart because he played there and everything, it was still very emotional, and there were still a lot of people around the program at that point that he knew still. A lot of these guys were attached with O'Leary, like you spoke about. And then, obviously this with Todd Stansbury, him and Geoff Collins are both in a really embattled position. Obviously that impacts Andrew Thacker, the DC, and Brent Key as well. But, they're sort of all hinging their hopes on turning the thing around at some point. There were people reporting that Geoff was going to be fired this weekend.
I was keeping an eye on that. I was watching your board and is this happening?
Yeah. And it's funny because I know how things work. It's very sort of reserved and slower pace. This isn't Auburn or something where a couple boosters are going to come in and cut a check for something to happen. They don't pay to fire people. And ultimately the blame sort of lies on what's happened. It lies on the head coach and the AD. So to me, the way I look at it is you played number 4 or whatever they are now, Clemson, and then you played an Ole Miss team, which until they get into the meat of their schedule, they could end up in the top 10 before. I haven't looked at how their schedule lays out, but if they catch the right order of teams, they could end up somewhere in there. They'll probably be at least a top 20 team by the end of the season.
Right.
So
big 1 and 2 is that's not a surprise. I mean,
yeah, like everyone thought they would be. What got everyone last week is they had the third punt block of the season, which I looked back as far as I could go, which is 1983, and they'd never had more than 2. They had 2 seasons with 2 historically. And I don't even know what the record is. That's such an obtuse stat that I can't even find it, like looking for A, Georgia Tech, or B, like looking for just the NCAA, like what's the record there. But the ironic part of that is Geoff Collins coaches that himself. So that didn't help either.
It's not a good look for him.
The air of the game. They lost 42-0, and that's what pissed everyone off, right? They played Clemson well for 3.5 quarters until one sort of bad drive where their best player got ejected on defense for targeting. There was a bad no call and a double false start on the offensive line that was a play that ended up with PI on a 3rd and forever. So, and that allowed Clemson to score more points, and then they kind of let go of the rope the 4th quarter. But they're on the streak right now. They've played the last 4 P5 games. They've been outscored 183-10 and shut out 3 times. So that's where the concern, the rub is for everyone, and why the frustration level is so high with the fan base. And they blame the AD as much as the coach for it. People that are kind of tracking things, because they brought in the Temple staff. You and I have both watched enough American football. They weren't exactly killing it at Temple with Geoff Collins. They had kind of taken over Matt Rule's thing, and we're doing okay, but they have bad losses and not play.
It was a small sample for when he was the head coach there. He wasn't there that long. He did reasonably well. Yeah. So why do you I know we could talk about this for 2 hours, but why do you think things haven't worked out for Geoff? Because I mean, on paper, it seemed like a great hire. Georgia Tech was a dream job of his. He had the ties there. He was successful as a defensive coordinator in the SEC in Mississippi State and Florida. He did have, maybe it wasn't a huge sample, but he did have the head coaching experience at Temple. He's a guy that looks like he gets it, as far as recruiting and relationships. He's all about the swagger and all the image and all that stuff. He's always been into that. So it looked like it would be a home run. Georgia Tech's in Atlanta, got a great talent pool just in that city alone. So what do you think was his downfall? Why do you think it hasn't worked out?
So there are 2 things that sort of stand out to me. One of them was the staff he put together initially. It had 2 guys on it, Brent Key, who was coming from Alabama, and Kerry Dixon, the receivers coach, who coached at Florida. No one else on the staff had P5 experience. Like, they had, defensive end coach at the time, who's now at Michigan State. Marco Coleman was a former player, had been a part-time NFL assistant before, had never coached in college. The offensive coordinator was a guy that was getting kind of booed by some Temple fans. They'd really struggled with like picking a quarterback, finding their system, all of that stuff offensively. He brings him in instead of bringing in, the guy that a lot of people were interested in that point, I think, was Jeff Lebby, to bring him in. I think they got outbid trying to get a couple other guys. He had been very vague when he took over about who the OC was going to be and what the system was they were going to run. And then the other thing is they just play down and up to teams. So he's 3-2 against FCS teams as a head coach. He lost a game at Temple to Villanova, who was not very good that year. And they lost one to Citadel the first year, which was a horrendous game. And they have this whole history. They played Syracuse in the 2020 season up there when they were dreadful and got beat down by that Syracuse team. There's this long sort of, Virginia Tech came here in 2019, I guess it was, and they lost 45-0 to a bad Virginia Tech team. They hadn't been shut out at home in 30 years at that point. They played Temple up at Temple and the first year and scored 2 points in that game on a safety. They dropped 2 touchdowns going into the end zone, I think, in that game. it's just sloppy. The team's been sloppy and undisciplined, and they don't. He talks about attention to detail and all these things, but you don't see it on the field. And
Yeah.
so Tech fans are pragmatic about things. They're very results. And if the team was improving and losing close games, or like you could see why it's not working, they'd understand that. But and there was a curve, like with the transition from the triple option. The offensive line is where the curve was.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that because, he was inheriting a roster that was recruited for the triple option, a little bit different from what he wanted to do. I guess that's not an excuse anymore, but was that an issue in those early years, being his first season being 2019?
I think with the offensive line, absolutely was. And the quarterback situation, which to me comes back to the OC, because they had opportunities to bring other guys in. And the OC at the time wasn't attractive enough to bring, they lost out on the Notre Dame kid to you guys.
Brandon Wimbush.
Yeah. They were trying to recruit him. Like he was like, looking at the OC's offense, was like, I don't think so. And it was funny because that didn't really work out for him either.
No, he started one game, and then Dylan Gabriel took over after that and was never seen again. So
yeah, and they just they got Jeff Sims, but they have struggled really until this class to find like another quarterback to that's of a caliber that you would expect to compete there. And he's a true freshman, is not ready. It's just like the pieces of the roster are kind of weird. And the biggest thing was Brent Key with his offensive line. He tried to kind of bodge it together with taking transfers and stuff. And the reality is they should have just signed like 12 offensive linemen in their first real class in 2020, because they've had, I think, 3 or 4 guys medical out now from that class. And they just don't have enough guys that have played. Like they took a kid from Kansas who never played at Kansas. That's their starting left tackle now, who's a redshirt freshman. He played his first snaps of his career against Clemson. Like the right guard is a walk-on kid that's a redshirt freshman from Southeast Georgia. Like they're just having a tough time. Brent Key's kind of whiffed on quite a few of his O-line guys, or they're just not ready because they're playing.
Yeah.
Their second year in their program, at best the third, and they're just not ready. Guys are playing maybe a little out of position. I think their right tackle, who Jordan Williams has been a 3-year starter for them, probably should be playing guard. Like he's just not quick enough. And he got killed. He was the guy who got killed in the Ole Miss game, but there's just something a little off there. The defense was also a rebuild. They were going from a 3-4 back to an even front with Jeff. They had lost all their defensive linemen except for one. The one guy who came back, Brandon Adams, was an NFL prospect. He died in the offseason. He had like a brain thing, died in like March of 2019. Just a tragedy. And they had 2 players die. Like they had Brandon Adams, and they had a kid that was a week from reporting.
I remember
Bryce
that.
Gowdy,
Yeah.
who stepped in front of a train because of mental health issues. So they've had nothing but terrible luck with stuff. And the program, the player development, the program piece is not, which is where Jeff was supposed to make his bones, is not lived up to the hype, I guess would be the way to say it.
Yeah, you kind of look back at the years. 2019, Jeff was 3-9. The 2020 season, which was weird, we know, was 3-7. Last season was 3-9. I believe the season ended on a 4 or 5 game losing streak, maybe.
Yeah, they
like
lost 5 in a row, I think, and got shut out in the final 2 games, 100-0.
Right.
I mean, yeah, there's not a lot of spin, right? Like,
yeah, and obviously 1-2 this season, which probably was the expectation. Most schools in the country would be 1-2 with that schedule. So Todd Stansbury, we talked about Geoff Collins. He's clearly on a hot seat. Stansbury, you kind of alluded to that. I take it he's kind of on a hot seat because this hire, a lot of people are looking at him because he was the AD that hired Jeff. What do you think about Stansbury's status? Is that really the one to look for before you look at what might happen to Jeff?
To me, there's always been a sequence of events. So last season, there were a lot of boosters, a lot of people around the program calling for Jeff to be fired. Collins' contract's terrible. Like, it's really one-sided. It's great for Jeff. It's not great for Georgia Tech. There's no like descending buyout, really. It just goes down by the years. Like,
yeah, I read where it's 7. If they fire him after this season, it's $7.2 million buyout, and it would have been like 10 million if you did it after this past year.
Yeah, and it's like it goes down. It's kind of vague too, having looked at the contract, like how there's like some interpretation maybe to what they would owe him before the 7.2 or whatever, for the rest of this year if they were to fire him or put him on leave or whatever. And that's on the AD. He made that deal. He gave him a 7-year deal, and no one understands why he did that because it wasn't really
Seven's a
appropriate.
lot for a coach that really wasn't proven.
No,
Yeah.
I mean, it was one thing if you're hiring, I would say like Jamie Chadwell, right, at Coastal Carolina. If you're hiring him somewhere and he's in a situation where you think it's going to be a bit of a rebuild. The
Yeah.
guy's won quite a lot of games over quite a bit of time and shown he's can build a program, right? Or Dave Clawson at Wake Forest, like if you were going to hire him, like Dave showed that he can build something. It takes 4 years or so to build it. The other main issue is that Geoff came out firing like, hey, we're going to be a top 20 program again. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. And, they've had some competitive quarters. They've had 1 or 2 decent games, but like it just hasn't been there. They haven't won back-to-back games since November of 2018 when Paul Johnson's last year. The 2 games before his last 2 games, which were those last 2 games were Georgia and Minnesota in the Detroit Quick Lane Bowl, which was awful. But yeah, it's just really inconsistent product week to week. Like even the quarterback Jeff Sims is up and down all the time. He actually didn't play well against Western Carolina either. He played really poorly against Ole Miss. Got sacked 7 times, so that didn't probably help his psyche. But he's just been real up and down for them. So I don't know what's going on there. It's a weird situation. To me, like you've got to do something but I understand like why it didn't happen this weekend, right? They lost 2 games you thought they were going to lose.
Right.
So they're on the road the next 2 weeks. They play UCF and Pitt. Now, if they're 1-4, which was sort of my worst case scenario, they play Duke and they have a bye week. I think that's where you make the change, but I can't imagine him trotting out against Duke if they're 1-4. Like people are going to go crazy. I just think that would be such a bad look for the school too. So I could see a situation where they force something to happen, but it's all sort of conjecture at this point too, because like no one really knows what ultimately school president has sort of the ultimate say, I guess, in it. And he's been quiet about kind of what he's thinking. I know people are in his ear about it, have been in his ear really since the middle of last season about like when the wheels started to come off the bus down the stretch. Like, what are we going to do here? Why is the school tied up in this? All those things. And this is as much of a must-win game as I've ever covered, probably for a coach, because I covered UGA and I've covered Georgia Tech. So I'm not even used to this. Like I covered, Georgia Tech missed 1 bowl game when Paul Johnson was here, and Mark Richt went every year when I was covering Georgia. So like I've never been in this situation. Like the guy, my counterpart at the AJC, was like the nicest guy in the world. We were sitting at the Notre Dame game, and he just looks over at me and goes, "Kelly, this is not fun to cover." Like it was such a beatdown, and it's hard, man. It's like tough on us, like covering it, dealing with the message boards, as when
fans are angry and they're calling people out. They want people fired, and
like people go crazy, man.
Like that 2015 season at UCF, it's tough because you've got relationships. These guys, these coaches. I mean, you interview them, you kind of build a rapport with them, and some of them sometimes look at the message board too, and they don't like to see their names being dragged through the mud. But has Todd Stansbury, has he talked about Geoff Collins' status? I imagine at some point, he's given an interview, he's been asked about it. What has Todd said?
So the only media that Todd Stansbury does is he does a radio hit once a week on the Tech affiliate 680 The Fan. Which
is that like a school kind of deal?
It's like 2 guys ask him like a handful of questions for like 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever the segment.
Are they kind of like softball questions where they're not really going to put him on the spot or challenge
for the most
him?
part? Yeah, like they'll get suggested questions from the school, like, "Hey, you should ask them this," and one of the guys, I know both of the hosts really well. I know their producers, and they'll occasionally like ask me what. Obviously, right now they don't need to bother asking me, but they'll ask me, "Is there anything interesting we should ask Todd about?" And I'll send them like, "Hey, this is going on," or that, because some of the things I'm curious about, and he won't talk to us. So like we've approached him multiple times, myself and the AJC guy. The AJC guy's gotten him sort of twice to go on the record about stuff, but not since the season started. And he ducked him after the Ole Miss game. He was sitting in there, had a sort of viral tweet of him. Todd was sitting underneath you have all these slogans in the room that we do the interviews in, which was the Hall of Fame room at Georgia Tech. And he was sitting sort of like down like this, and he had winning over the top of him, like as a slogan, like
It's
winning.
ironic. Yeah.
And yeah, I was just like, oh, this is. I feel bad tweeting this, but it is really sort of funny and ironic. So I'm just gonna go for it.
Got to get that content.
Yeah, today there was a funny thing that happened. The coach, so Coach Collins' office, which was Coach O'Leary's office, I think, maybe not then. They may have redone it after that, but one side of it faces the field, and the other side faces the inside of the building. So we do our interviews out on the plaza outside, basically in the stadium stands, and that was just a lingering thing from COVID, and they just decided to keep doing it because it was sort of a pleasant backdrop, and it was outside. Some sort of animal had defecated outside Coach Collins' office and left it there. And
that's not a good. That's
yet, I guess. And it was just like, I was like, man, I really want to tweet about this, but
maybe that's a little bit much.
Yeah, I was like,
that's a bit much.
Crossing the line like a little bit, but it was funny. And everyone thought it was funny. I'm sure Geoff would have thought it was funny too. Like, that's the thing that sucks about this, and you know this. Like, you get relationships with all these people.
Like, I liked him. He was a good guy. You know,
he's a good guy.
I liked all those guys on the staff. Yeah.
Yeah, he has like giving me nicknames. He's been super nice to me. One time I made the mistake of showing up. It started raining, and I had like a little water jacket or whatever, and I threw it on, not thinking about it. It was red, like bright red. And
Georgia colors.
And he was like, I walked in, and he saw me, and he ran over to the sideline and grabbed, the special teams, like little jerseys you put on that are like orange or yellow or whatever. He put it on me and said that you have to wear this while you're out here on the field. He's a funny dude. Like,
George O'Leary, he would do stuff like that too. I'd hear when he was at Georgia Tech. No one ever was allowed to wear red, anywhere near him.
Yeah, you couldn't even have red pens in the building. That was like the rule. Which, I understand it's entertaining. Like, it's rivalry stuff. I get it. So it was amusing to me that they had a good sense of humor about it. But yeah, that's the thing that sucks. Like, I like him. Todd Stansbury's fine. I don't really have a relationship with him. He's been nice to me whenever I've had to talk to him about something, or just the few times I've gotten to talk to him a little bit on the side. But it is what it is, man. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's a business. And, the guys aren't getting it done. Money's gone down. Season ticket sales are down. The attendance is going to be probably at all-time low for the rest of the season. So you got to, at some point, what happens matters in terms of just where you are with your product on the field, and are fans still engaged with it, and you can't lose them forever by showing disinterest in it. So I think that's the sort of inflection point to me, more than even the record, is just the number of times they've looked really ill prepared or have looked bad. It's a reflection on Geoff and obviously Todd Stansbury. And Todd, this was the one thing that was interesting about Todd that was kind of made me nervous as someone that covers them. When he was going into the search, it was the first time he'd ever hired a real revenue sport coach.
That was the thing. At UCF, he was there only 3 years, from 2012 to 2015. He never really fired or hired anybody. And what people used to say around UCF is George O'Leary was the true AD. O'Leary was the AD of football, and Stansbury was the AD of everything else. And there was a coach that contributed. The former AD was the main guy, but Donnie Jones got UCF men's basketball on probation, and it would have made sense to make a change there, but he wouldn't do it. And, he kept his job even through the sanctions and the scholarship reductions and the postseason ban. And people always laughed about Stansbury, like he won't fire anybody. So and he was kind of media shy. I don't really remember him doing much media. I just remember if it had to do with football, I mean. That was O'Leary. That was O'Leary's department. The coaches' tours, you rarely would hear, Stansbury get up and talk. But
well, I mean, it's so weird because like we had Mike Babinski, who's the AD now at Purdue, and people called him Sasquatch because they didn't see him around much. But I saw him all the time, and he talked to me all the time. He would come give an interview if I needed something. He'd pick up the phone. Dan Radakovich, who's at Miami now, was at Clemson. I left Tech for Clemson. Dan and I would talk like literally multiple times a week. Like, I would go sit in Paul Johnson's office and talk to him and Radakovich. We would do like our media at like noon or something, and then they practiced in the afternoon when Paul was there, and we'd have like 2-3 hours to kill, and Paul would have me come up to his office and Dan would come in, and we just chat about everything. I was sitting there one day when they were talking about the Big Ten was trying to recruit Georgia Tech
I remember that. That was
when Rutgers
pivotal. Like in retrospect, that was a huge move, I guess, that Georgia Tech did not make.
Well, and that's why Dan left. Like Dan wanted to go, and he got blocked like by the school president at the time, Bud Peterson. He said, "No, I don't think it's a fit." Paul Johnson was against it, but his vote didn't really count all that much. It was they needed the money, and it made sense it would fill the stadium up too. Like you're not playing Duke really, or Virginia, who don't really bring many people. If you play, Michigan State, or you're playing Ohio State,
it doesn't have to be Ohio State or Penn State. All those Big Ten, they've got tons of alums all over the country, especially in a city like Atlanta. I mean, every game would be a sellout easily.
Well, it's like a bowl game to them. Like like these people will even just Big Ten fans would come watch those games, right? Like, and that's where, maybe their lone hope, and if this continues to consolidate, is that, maybe the Big Ten goes to I think at a certain level they have interest, but it's not if they're at 20 or something. It's got to be more than that at this point. But that was when people were just gobbling up media markets, and Rutgers basically got in because Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia Tech all told them no. And so that opened the door for Rutgers to this magical jump up for them.
That's the one. That's the most perplexing move that's ever been done in conference realignment. I mean, we know why. I mean, they supposedly, I guess they brought the New York market for the cable dollars for Big Ten Network, but other than that, they brought nothing else.
No, they were bad in most sports too, other than wrestling and some of the more obtuse non-revenue sports. But their basketball team's finally been good the last few years, but they were a zero there. They were a zero in football, and really made no sense. And then Maryland's kind of marginalized themselves in terms of just the fan draw. It's much more about people who live in DC, Virginia coming to the games than, the old rivalries they had, particularly basketball. They lost all their basketball stuff because that was their big draw, was playing Duke and, North Carolina and all that stuff.
So, I mean, I know how these seasons go, and this happens on any message board when, they think a coach is on the hot seat. All the fans are like, "Here's my short list of candidates. Here's who so and so. Here's who we should hire." What are the names that Georgia Tech fans like to put out there? I've seen some buzz about Deion Sanders potentially coming over that way. What's the hot name that if there is a change, and it seems like there's a decent chance that'll happen? Who's the coach you think fans want to see at Georgia Tech?
So there's sort of two schools of thought at the moment. One is, there's three people that the fans seem to like, but the two main ones are Deion. There's a group of people that think he's like a better version of Geoff Collins.
Okay.
It's hard to tell because to me, watching Deion and what they're doing, it's sort of like what Florida State did when he was playing there. They are just more talented than the other teams in the league, right? And so they have a competitive advantage. So you wonder how much of that is what's at play there. You can't really ramp that up at Georgia Tech. You can't be more talented than, Georgia or Alabama or Clemson.
So he can't just take anybody and everybody. I know he's, played for the Falcons. Obviously, everyone knows who he is in Atlanta, get all that talent. There are some recruiting restrictions to a degree that Georgia Tech can't just take anybody, right?
Yeah, they have a certain number of exceptions where they can get sort of borderline NCAA qualifiers in. But the reality is it can only take so much. You'd have to really amp up the support system there, spend a ton of money on that to keep those kids in school. And you also, some of them are just going to be miserable with how strong the academic piece is.
There's no easy majors, right? I mean, it's not, liberal studies. Georgia Tech doesn't have majors like that.
Yeah, there's no liberal arts school whatsoever. So everyone has to take basically the equivalent of calculus. That's usually a deal breaker for some kids. My older brother was recruited there by Bobby Ross, and they told him that you'd have to take calculus, and he was good he was like an AP math student and all that stuff, and he was like, nope, not interested. Don't have anything I want to major in. He wanted a liberal arts degree. He was into cartography. It was just a deal breaker for him. And so that comes into play a lot. But yeah, there's the Hill they refer to that run the academic side.
Academics, yeah.
It's a big thing. It's one of the things that's so different about covering Georgia Tech than anywhere else is I do have to ask those questions of recruits is how are you academically, or find out how they're doing in school through sources to find out if they can even get in. And there's always a little bit of drama with a couple of kids towards it.
Yeah.
after signing day, whether they're having to take tests or take certain classes because they need certain core classes to go to Georgia Tech from high school. So that's a thing with Dion. Can he get his son into school? I have no idea like what his academic thing is. So those are sort of the issues there with Dion, but it would be a splashy hire. Bill O'Brien would be the not splashy hire, but a guy that worked at Georgia Tech. Um, Definitely knows what's going on there. He turned them down. He was the first guy they sort of approached when Paul Johnson retired, and he was coming off a playoff season with the Texans, so that wasn't happening.
Yeah.
But they made him say no, from what I understand. Just be like, I'm not interested. Just if it was a feeling out, maybe I'm sure it wasn't a job offer, but they called to feel him out about it, and he just wasn't interested at the time, which made sense. He wants a job badly. He was in play at LSU this past year. He's been in play at other jobs. He's rumored to be involved in Nebraska and some other jobs like that as a possible guy. I would think he definitely would get a call. How interesting would he be? Sort of like going from like a croissant to wheat bread.
These are different personalities going from Geoff Collins to Bill
O'Brien.
But
he's just a reserved kind of old school coach, right?
Right.
The other one that people bring up a lot is Jamie Chadwell at Coastal. Some people are interested in him. I don't know enough about him. It's weird to me that he hasn't gotten a job already. It's weird to me that South Carolina didn't hire him. So, what is the sort of holdup? Is it him being really picky about where he wants to go? Is it there's something else going on? You saw that with Memphis with Mike Norvell, right? Like he had a lot of trouble getting a job in Memphis.
Yeah. People always said there were some skeletons in his closet. I don't know what they were, but there was something that kind of prevented him from getting hired from some places.
Yeah, there were always a lot of rumors kind of about what different things that happened or whatever at jobs, and how much of that is true, how much of it isn't, is always interesting. With him, I heard a lot of it wasn't, but it was clouding probably his hiring situation. So those are sort of the three guys. To me, like it's really hard to gauge because I think they're going to have a new AD make the hire. I certainly think even if Todd were here for some reason, still, I don't think anyone. From what the boosters have even said on record, a lot of them don't trust him to make that decision. And the way the search was handled the last time was super weird. They didn't interview a lot of people that people thought should have been interviewed. And there were a lot of people sort of against Collins getting hired that had been here when he was here before and knew he was kind of a job climber. And he's a guy who had never been anywhere more than 3 years in his career at any assistant job or anything. He'd always jump from one job to another. Some of the time he was clawing his way up. Some of it wasn't. He moved backwards a couple of times. So I don't know what you got to do. To me, like there's two different thoughts is what fires up your fan base. But to me, I think it's more about player development and having a consistent product. And, my concern with Bill O'Brien, he'd just be Chan Gailey 2.0, but he did a really good job at Penn State in really difficult circumstances. I just don't know he would sign up for it either. That's a whole other discussion.
So what do you think the landscape of recruiting is going to be where whoever the next coach is, if there is a coaching change? Obviously, we just talked about there's academic issues you've got to deal with as a head coach at Georgia Tech. But in the last year, as we all know, recruiting has changed. It's not necessarily about location and facilities and you like the coaching staff. It comes down to NIL and what kind of opportunities are there? Are there collectives that may, pay me some income? Can I make money off my name, image, and likeness? What's the scene like? Obviously, major metro, one of the biggest cities in the U.S., like Atlanta, capital of the South. But a lot of these are collectives that pool their money and kind of, you're really not supposed to do it, I don't think, but they go out and basically it's pay for play. They go out and recruit players with offers. And I think we've seen it where some of the schools where it was always, obvious that there were boosters maybe doing stuff under the table. They were the quickest ones when this was all legal. Now we've got collectives in place. We're getting going. And the schools that played by the rules have been a little bit slower to get in on this NIL collective game. So where's Georgia Tech with that? Are they becoming more of a player that can, maybe recruit a transfer, with an offer? Where does Georgia Tech stand with that?
That's sort of been the biggest project in the offseason. They were, like a lot of teams, sort of gun shy about what to do and how big the numbers would get. I think everyone was really caught off guard because the reality, we talked about this before we came on the air, but like the schools that were, let's say, walking interesting lines in recruiting.
Yeah, the Texas A&Ms of the world, the Alabamas, the Auburns. Yeah,
like just these schools where there's sort of a history of generosity from boosters. It has not been.
That's one way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, like I'm trying to think of how to like put it in a
yeah, that's a good way. I like that generosity from boosters. Exactly, that's great.
Yeah, so like those places really accelerated fast through this Ole Miss. Is one that is always kind of notorious for that. They are out in the forefront of it. A&M obviously has jumped way out in front to the point where they're getting called out by other schools, and they have some teams sort of in the middle like Alabama or Georgia, and then there's sort of everyone else, right, that's trying to figure it out. Georgia Tech has a decent plan. They have sort of two money collectives and a philanthropic collective that does sort of charity work. The two ones are like the same ones I think they're everywhere else. There's one that's for the current players that is player led, and then there's one that's a like outside business that does like, come do Twitter Spaces or come do to this bar or whatever.
And that may be the similar. I think Dreamfield runs a similar when they started off at UCF, and I know they branched out to Georgia Tech. So let's talk a little bit about this game. It seems like we've been talking about everything else, but there's a lot to talk about with this matchup. But obviously the players, they're feeling the pressure. They know they're 1-2. They know the staff that recruited them, clearly is on the hot seat. How do you think players feel about this situation, and what do you expect to see from them? Obviously, 42-0 loss at Ole Miss was not a good game. Do you think they rise up? Do you think they fold to the pressure? How do you think players respond in a situation like this? They're going on the road, going to be a hot one, 20-point underdog. How do you think they face this challenge?
It was funny to see the line moved in like an hour.
Yeah.
I think it was like 14 or 13 and a half or something. And it jumped to 18 or 19, like before like the night was over. To me, like it all rides on Jeff Sims, a quarterback. If he plays well, if he's the good Jeff Sims, then they have a chance to be in the game. And the team gets inspired when he plays well. When he doesn't play well, they fold up a lot and things get out of hand. Don't have a punt blocked, like don't have field goals blocked. Those have both been major issues with them. And those are killers for you. Like they suck all the wind out of the room. And to me, Georgia Tech's sort of that fragile mindset for whatever reason. Like, I don't know what that's the one confusing to me, because that really was never an issue with the teams I saw, even with Chan, like, from watching it from afar, they would be getting their butt kicked by Georgia in a game, but they'd still be trying. Yeah. It just seems like last week they kind of folded up, and that was kind of ugly to see. And there was a lot of guys. It seemed like there was a lot of unhappy people on the sideline, and so that's where I question where it's going to be. I've heard the practice has been really intense this week. Guys have been kind of getting after each other to step up. What does that look like on the field? That's sort of where my question lies. Like, I think that they have a lot to play for. The one thing that's always fascinated me by watching Gus Malzahn is like he can find a way to make a game interesting that probably shouldn't be. You guys have seen that. He's playing Louisville twice. I've seen that, right? Like, yeah. I still remember the game last year. I was watching it, and I texted a buddy. I was like, "Oh man, I think Gus is about to Gus this." And sure enough, like they had a bad strategy at the fourth quarter, and it cost them the game. But that's sort of an X factor thing. I imagine that Gus is going to try to run the ball and dominate them and try to push them around. Ole Miss ran for like 300 something yards last week. They just kind of were able to break off runs. Run fits were bad, things like that, bad tackling. So those things can be cleaned up. They did it against Clemson. They showed it. Clemson's no slouch. Their offense is still a little stuck, but to me, I think you got to make Plumlee beat you in the pocket, keep him in the pocket, don't let him run around. It's clear that when he gets something going and gets
that's right. Louisville probably gave Georgia Tech the blueprint of how you try to defend this offense, because we still don't really know how good this UCF team is. They played an FCS team. It was you can't take anything away from that game for the most part. And then Louisville.
Then they played the clown show at FAU.
Yeah, and FAU is FBS, but I'm not sure if their defense is much better than an FCS defense. So, everyone's feeling good coming off a win, but even though Georgia Tech hasn't had the greatest start to this season, they've got better athletes in FAU.
Yeah, so to me, like I think if you were to look at it position by position, maybe other than Malik Cunningham and a couple of guys, Georgia Tech has a better roster than Louisville, but they're not playing that way right now. So that's sort of the rub, right? Like, do you get the team that beat Miami a couple of years ago, and Miami that is given games to, really the UCF game in 2020 was close for 3 quarters, and then they pulled away late in the game and got a bunch of scores. Um, is it that? Is it, and that's the thing that's so intriguing about Tech is they really struggle to put two really solid halves together. They were 14-10 with Clemson with a chance to get off the field at the beginning of the season and get the ball back with all the momentum in the game. And there's a play where 2 linemen jump off sides. They don't call it. There's a PI downfield. They get a first down and then drive down and score. And that was sort of the ball game. Those things, they've had a lot of these momentum killers. Ole Miss converted a bunch of 3rd and longs in the game where they had an opportunity to get off the field. They had the pump block. It was 7-0 game. They had the pump block that they had some momentum playing defensively a little bit. They gave up a cheap touchdown and it was sort of over from there. Those are the things that are, if they can avoid that, they have a chance. They didn't match up really well with Ole Miss's defense either. Ole Miss was good, they had a good front four, and then they would just drop guys into coverage. And so, it's hard to play that because they were getting sacks. They were getting coverage sacks and getting sacks without bringing pressure. They'd have 6 blockers and send 4 and get through. Is UCF going to do that? I don't know. Like the UCF defense has played well this year from what I've seen. Like I watched part of 2 games already. I watched almost all of the Louisville game, and I watched some of the FAU game. And, to me, like UCF should win this game, but, you don't know. Like I don't know if they're it clearly being a back against the wall situation, if that galvanizes the team or not. I don't know if like Plumlee and those guys are finally finding their groove and that confidence from FAU carries over into this game. Those are sort of like those weird X factors.
I can't answer that either. John Rice, had a great opening game, struggled a bit. The entire offense really struggled a bit against Louisville, especially in the second half. There were some touchdowns called back. It's still a game UCF should have won. And then everyone looked great against FAU. I mean, John Rice, passing for over 300, rushing for over 100, conference player of the week. I mean, he's, jumping over guys for a touchdown. I mean, made a lot of exciting plays. But yeah, we got to see it now against a better defense than what we saw last week. So there's still a lot of questions there. But obviously, Jeff Sims is entrenched as the starting quarterback. But you've always talked about his inconsistency. Is he really the only option there? Is there a guy waiting in the wings where maybe if Jeff feels like we need to get a spark, is there a promising freshman? Is there anyone in the mix other than Jeff? Like, is there any chance of a quarterback change?
I think you could see Zach Gibson. He's a transfer from Akron, a kid from Atlanta. He played a little bit there. He is the issue I find with playing him is Jeff's really mobile, can run and get away from guys. Zach is.
So if the offensive line is struggling, you need a guy who can hopefully evade a rush.
Yeah, and Zach's more of a pocket guy. He runs okay, but like that would be my concern with him. He hasn't played, here yet. What would that look like? But he has a little bit of something to him. Like I don't know what it is. Like a little bit of the. I don't want to say Brett Favre because I don't want to give the guy that much credit. But like, like a little moxie, right?
Yeah.
I thought they should have played him last week for a series just to see if he did anything to push Jeff to. I could see a situation this week if Jeff Sims struggles where they throw him out there just to shake Jeff up to see if it does anything. But, there's a huge gulf between even watching them in practice between the two. And then the 2 other quarterbacks, Pumachan, the kid that transferred from Clemson, he looks like a guy that would, he struggles to throw the football. Like he looks like a triple option quarterback to me. And then Zach Pyron, the true freshman from Alabama, he's not ready. It's moving too fast for him right now. I think he's a guy that has a lot of potential down the road, but it's throwing him into a road game like this, where it's going to be, credit where credit due. Like they have a great environment, at UCF with the bounce house and all that. I don't know that that's what you want to do there either. So I don't really, see the backup situation being that great, but I could see them trying something if Jeff comes out flat. He's come out flat to start the last 2 games. He played well against Clemson and then had really not a great game against Western Carolina and then was terrible against Ole Miss. And he was running for his life to make a point there. It wasn't just that he was, playing poorly. He had got sacked 7 times. So, only 2 of the sacks were on him. The other ones he was pressured 20 times in the game or something like that. Yeah, so like
Yeah.
it was pretty ugly. So
Yeah.
you know, to me, that's what this all sort of rides on to me, because when he plays well, I think it lifts the entire team up. The defense is capable of playing better than they are. They're much better at rushing the passer than they've been for the last few years. It's just there's something not quite right, and that's where you wonder if it's coaching or it's the mental approach by the kids or whatever, not buying into it.
Who are some of the, other than Geoff, we've talked a lot about, who are maybe two or three other names on the team, offensively, defensively, maybe some stars of the team, guys that you're definitely going to notice watching the game on Saturday? Who are some of the players to watch on Georgia Tech?
So Dante Smith, the running back, he's been a little dinged up, but he's a really dynamic guy. I think he ran for 100 yards against Western Carolina on just 9 carries. He's one of the top PFF running backs last year, and he was the third running back behind Jahmyr Gibbs, who transferred to Alabama, and Jordan Mason, who's the running back for the 49ers now. EJ Jenkins, EJ Jenkins is a real sort of X factor guy. He's 6'7" outside wide receiver and built like a giant tight end. He looks like he plays for like the Magic or something. Like he looks like an NBA small forward.
Really?
And he really athletic. Still working on his hands a little bit, route running and stuff, because he played so much tight end. He was at South Carolina before. He's been good for them in the red zone. Nate McCollum, their slot's been really good this year. He's probably been their best all-around player. He's a punt returner and their slot guy. He can run the ball out of the slot on the jet sweep. He can catch balls. He's their most reliable receiver and a good punt returner. Defensively, Keon White's been really good for them. Pass rusher, kid from Old Dominion that missed most of the last year with a leg injury. And then Charlie Thomas, when he plays well at linebacker, he's been their best player. He was second on the team in tackles through 2 games. He played 4 quarters and 2 series because of a targeting ejection early in the Clemson games in the second half. And he was still there going into it with a pick and a couple sacks and a couple TFLs. He's sort of their eraser guy. Like if containment's broken or back cuts loose or whatever on the backside, he's the guy that handles the weak side linebacker. The other guy who's played really well is Jalen King, the free safety. I think he has 2 picks this year already. He's just a smart kid, plays well. But, they've just haven't quite meshed on defense or offense yet. So it's one of those things. I think the 4th game is when you kind of know what your team is that you cover. And I think these next 2 games we'll find out what Georgia Tech really is.
Kelly, this has been a lot of fun. I don't know if we envisioned talking close to an hour, but there was so many fun topics to talk about, a lot of drama, a lot of interesting things, the parallels obviously between the 2 schools. So I've had a blast talking to you. I appreciate you joining me and educating UCF Nation, I guess, a little bit about Georgia Tech. And I guess I'm going to see you. Are you coming down to the game on Saturday?
Yeah, I'll be down there. Yep. Looking forward to seeing what the hell happens.
The bounce house, seeing that in action. It should be a good atmosphere. I think the weather is going to hold off. It's going to be hot, but I think there's a storm, in the Atlantic. I think it's going to draw the moisture away. So I think we won't have to worry about lightning delays or rain, because every game UC has played this year has been affected by rain a little bit. So that's good. So I appreciate it, Kelly, and I'll see you on Saturday.
Thanks, Brandon. Appreciate it.
Take care.